All right, so we are live. Hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Jendrick, a local realtor here on PEI with Keller Williams Select. And I have with me Derek Bondt of Key Murray Law.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on. As Sarah said, my name is Derek. I'm a lawyer here with Key Murray Law in Summerside, PEI. Yeah.
And so we're here to answer some questions that people commonly have around real estate. Derek can address, the legal aspects of real estate. We'll get into it.
Sure.
So, Derek, what's the top common question you hear all the time?
There's a variety of different questions that people have, specifically with generally people buying a home for the first time have a lot of questions, which is understandable. Usually it has to do with land transfer tax and how that's applicable. So for a lot of first-time home buyers, if it's the first time you're owning property and you're a resident of PEI, then you're eligible not to have to pay that 1% of the purchase price of a property. We get you to sign an affidavit to say that and declare that you're a first-time home buyer and you've been on the province for a certain amount of time, and then therefore you don't have to pay that 1%, which is, on a $300,000 purchase, that's $3,000. So that's a fairly, substantial amount of money. For vendors, usually we come down to there's a lot of rural properties on PEI, and they may not be connected to a sewer system. So a lot of properties will have their own well and septic. So generally on those types of transactions, vendors are responsible to ensure that they have a clear water test done. And it's really important that people have a third party do those. We've run into issues with that before. So those are some common questions that we see. Another big area is non-resident purchasing land on PEI. For non-residents to hold. This can be addressed by applying to the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission for an exemption for non-residents to purchase land if it exceeds the amount that they're allowed to have. So generally a couple, so if let's say two people are going to buy land on PEI, they're allowed up to 10 acres of land or approximately 320 feet of shore frontage. We'll have to confirm that exact number, but it's in that range. So it's about 165, 150 feet of land, or of shore frontage rather, per person, or 5 acres of land per person. So the good thing is if you're two people buying, then you're allowed double that. So 10 acres or 320 feet of shore frontage. If the property you wish to buy exceeds that amount, that's fine. You can still apply. The big thing that the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission wants to see is they want to make sure that the property's been advertised for a certain number of days. I believe it's 90 days at least, to make sure that island residents have the opportunity to purchase the property first. The other thing too that we run into is that you're a PEI resident. So a residency as defined under the Lands Protection Act is you have to be on PEI for a period of 365 days over a 2-year period. So essentially what that means is that if you lived on PEI kind of sporadically over 2 years, but it adds up to a year, then you're a resident and you don't have to apply to the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission. But if you're, let's say, just moving from Ontario and you want to buy a 50-acre piece of land, then we'll have to apply to IRAC. And it's a flat, well, no, if the purchase price is under, I believe it's $50,000 or $60,000, I'd have to confirm, then it's a fee, it's the application fee is about $600. And beyond that, there's almost like a percentage-wise fee to apply for the application. So it can run up to, I think, a maximum of $2,500. So there's application fees if you're looking to purchase land that exceed the allowable amount.
And is there extra legal fees from the lawyer if you have to get into that?
Yeah, generally, because we'll work with the purchaser. I shouldn't say that. The purchaser certainly has the option to do the application to the Island Regulatory and Appeals Commission themselves. we would provide you the form, and you can kind of do it on your own. We certainly would offer the service, though, if someone would want some assistance. We generally charge between $400 and $500 to assist with that application, on top of the legal fees we normally charge for a purchase. So, yeah.
And, looks like we have 2 viewers so
Oh,
far. If
excellent.
anybody has any questions, feel free to ask.
By all means, yeah.
Let's see, what else is there? How much can a person, like say first-time home buyers,
Sure.
how much should they be budgeting for their legal fees?
Sure. So that's a great question. We always kind of walk people through, especially if it's their first time buying a home, on the closing costs. Our firm, we work on essentially what's called a tariff-based system, where our legal fees are tied into the purchase price of the property. Other firms do it differently, so it's always good to call ahead and just to get an idea of what the legal fees are going to be. Generally, it ranges anywhere from $1,000 to $2,500. Again, it kind of depends on the purchase price. And that's for the legal fees. So we always kind of walk people through your legal fees. Let's say are $1,500, just as an example. We also have to register the deed to the property as well as the mortgage, assuming you're getting a mortgage. And the registry fees for the mortgage and the deed are dependent on the purchase price of the property and the amount of the mortgage. So the registry office has a tariff sheet that we go by to say, okay, well, if the purchase price of the home is $200,000, then the deed registration for that is going to be $375 as an example. So you want to budget, so let's say $1,500 for legal fees, then you're going to want to budget, let's say $375 to register the deed, $375 to register the mortgage. If there's land transfer tax, then you want to budget that as well. But if you're first-time home buyer, as discussed, then you don't have to pay that. Normally on Prince Edward Island, 99% of the lenders, I'm going to say all of them, require that we purchase on your behalf a title insurance policy, which is attached to your mortgage. It's essentially, because PEI is a very antiquated land registry system, the banks require we get a one-time insurance policy to cover any potential issues that might arise either during the ownership of the home with respect to access, boundaries, even water, potability. That can be covered in an insurance policy that we get. That fee can range anywhere between $175 to $325. So and that's a one-time fee that we'll arrange and we will pay on your behalf. And then, depending if there is an oil tank on your property or on the property that you're going to purchase, normally the practice here in PEI is that the vendor will fill the fuel tank to the maximum, either oil or propane, and then we'll do an adjustment on the purchase price at the closing to say, okay, well, the vendor is paid $600 to fill up the tank, and then you as the purchaser will pay the vendor that amount of money on the closing date. It depends on what the vendor wants to do, but it essentially takes the guesswork out of saying, well, there's only, the oil tank's half full, so we'll pay $300. What they essentially do is say, okay, we'll call Irving or Superior or whoever the fuel provider is, and they'll come on the day of closing, fill up the tank, and then the purchaser pays for that full price of the tank. So you want to have a discussion with your lawyer or your realtor to get an idea of some of the closing costs that you're going to want to look at. Like I said, anywhere from the deed registration to the mortgage registration, title insurance, legal fees, any fuel adjustments. The other thing too is sometimes vendors will pay their property taxes early. So then we make an adjustment for property taxes that might be owing back to the vendor. So yeah, it's a good idea to have that discussion, just a ballpark for your budgeting. If you're going to need to set aside $4,000 or $5,000 for closing costs. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna pick up my phone here to
Yeah,
share
sure.
the video to my own
Yeah.
Facebook, so
Yeah.
hopefully we get more people viewing.
Yeah, no problem.
um,
That's a lot of information to take in.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So, what would you say is the most interesting real estate thing you've run into so far?
Let's see. There's how do I put it? People have different, needs and demands whenever they're looking to purchase or sell a property. We certainly the realtors and if the vendors and the purchasers are agreeable and flexible, we can usually make things happen, as we need to make them happen. So, as many people are aware, in the last year or two, there's been a huge influx of non-island residents purchasing property in PEI. So I think of an example where we ran into an issue with a couple coming from Ontario that were buying a farm property here. And the vendor was under the impression that they were able to kind of separate land without prior approval from the land office. That unfortunately wasn't being able to happen in time for the closing. But because the vendors and purchasers were quite agreeable to each other, we essentially were able to close on kind of the understanding and agreement that they would pay a certain amount of money for the house and small acreage now, and then hold money in trust and allow the vendor the applicable time to get the appropriate subdivision confirmed and finalized, such that they could complete the rest of the sale almost 6 months later. So if people are agreeable and flexible, we can make certain things happen. Yeah, because there's, people, especially non-island residents come here, they just have to make sure that they're well aware of some of the, I'd say, quirky rules that we have here with respect to land protection. So, yeah, and there's, always anything from, if patio furniture isn't cleaned properly on the day of closing, then that can be an issue for some people. Or, any kind of minor types of things can arise on closing dates. So it's just, and again, it can be stressful for people, especially if they've got moving trucks booked and we're supposed to have, be in there at noon. What I would advise always to people is, and to realtors, is try not to have everything closed at the end of the month, because it makes it very challenging for everybody if there's a lot of closings at the same time. Another thing too is we're at the mercy of the bank when it comes to receiving funds. So generally, how we work a transaction is that we won't close until obviously the vendors have their money and the purchasers have the deed to the property and the keys. The challenge we sometimes run into is that the banks that we deal with, all their head offices are based either Montreal, Toronto, or somewhere else in the country. And despite the fact that we've requested funds 2 or 3 days in advance, the funds from your mortgage company might not hit our trust account until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. So if you're ready to close on February 15th, and you've booked your moving truck for 9 a.m. on February 15th, we might not be in a position to give you the keys right at 9 a.m. So some advice might be to, book a day or so after the closing to make sure that everything's finalized and you can move in, as opposed to booking things right at 8 a.m. on the day of closing, because we often won't have the funds in ready to go at that time. So, yeah.
What about people buying like investment properties compared to residential properties? Is there any difference in the legal aspect?
Well, it depends. If you're looking at, like, say, a multi-unit type of property, and it depends if the purchaser are, if you're a company, then there'd be a little bit of background work on our end in terms of either financing or doing whatever corporate documentation is needed to reflect the approval of the company to purchase the building. That's one thing that we would assist with. The other thing too is generally if we're dealing with commercial properties, we always have to be aware of HST if it's applicable or not. So we can certainly work with the purchaser and or the vendor, obviously depending on which one, and their accountant, just to make sure that we have all the I's dotted and the T's crossed with respect to applicable taxes or the requirement for certain corporate documentation to be done. So yeah, it's really a case by case, it depends. The other thing too, people selling land have to be aware of, specifically if it's farmland or any land that's been used for commercial purposes, either forestry or land that's been rented. That's deemed to be a commercial endeavor, and therefore the HST would likely be applicable on the sale. So you want to make sure you have that conversation with your realtor or accountant when you're doing up the agreement of purchase and sale to make sure that everyone's aware of that, how HST is going to work. Yeah, and then you work sometimes with the purchaser. They're going to carry on with the commercial endeavor of the property, and they're an HST registered, and we're able to do kind of a wash, we call it. Or if let's say the purchasers are going to use it for residential and non-commercial, then we have to look at how HST is going to be factored into the purchase price and how we're going to permit and all those things. So yeah.
And on the note of HST, something I always like to draw to people's attention is when you're budgeting for your house, you need to remember that all those quotes that you get from, contractors, from your lawyer, they're all before HST.
Yeah.
So you need to do the math to work HST into your budget.
Yeah.
That's
and I'd
always a shock.
Oh, for sure. And one thing too, for people selling their house, and when we deal with real estate commissions, people have to remember too that there's HST applicable on the commission.
Yeah.
For realtors, on the vendor side, because usually what happens is I'll sit down with the vendor and we go through what we call the statement of adjustments, where we outline, okay, the purchase price was this, and then we'll go through, if there's a mortgage to be paid out, and then if we have to pay for the satisfaction of the mortgage, that's usually a fee that the registry makes us pay. It's like $7.25. And then usually how it works is the commission for the realtor comes through our office. So we get a commission statement from the realtor, and then we'll pay the difference back to the realtor, and then we give the vendor the rest of the money. So yeah, usually for vendors, just be aware that the commission, there's HST on that. So if it's, let's say, $5,000, it's $5,000 plus HST. And one thing too that people usually are questions about is the deposit that's paid. So usually a deposit of $1,000 or $2,000 is paid whenever the agreement is signed. That deposit will generally go to the vendor's realtor's office and is used as a credit towards the commission. So if, for example, the total commission plus taxes and everything was $5,000 and the purchaser's already paid a $1,000 deposit, so then at the end of the day, we would then pay $4,000 to the realtor's, the vendor's realtor, to complete that $5,000.
Yeah, and that deposit is held in trust until after the transaction is complete.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
What else do you get at?
Yeah, no, I'm trying to think. There's lots of different scenarios that people have. One thing, generally when you want to meet with your lawyer, or you're discussing, purchasing a home, you want to have it depends on your relationship with either someone you're buying the home with. You want to have the discussion of a joint tenancy versus tenancy in common. So generally, a couple that's buying a home is in it for the long haul, and they want to, ensure that if one of them is to pass, then the home is automatically transferred to the remaining spouse or partner. But that scenario might be different if it's two friends or three friends or a business partnership or whatever, whereby if you're buying an apartment building per se, you may want to structure it differently, where if one of the people is to pass, then it goes to that person's estate and not automatically to the surviving person. So that's one thing you want to have a thought about. It depends on your situation, obviously. The other thing too is specifically for vendors, lawyers will often ask your marital or spousal status when you're selling. It's not to pry. It's merely for the fact that we have to ensure that if the property you're selling is what's deemed a family home, and if for whatever reason the spouse is not a party to the deed, or if they don't have any ownership of the home on paper, they will still have to sign the deed to release any interest that they might have in that family home. So just kind of general things, both on the selling and purchasing side, to have a conversation with your lawyer about either how you want to have the deed drafted and set up for when you're buying, And just as kind of an FYI, as to, some of the questions the lawyer might ask regarding your spousal status. Now, obviously, people own different properties that aren't family homes, and we'll just say, okay, well, it's not a family home, and then therefore it's not applicable. So yeah.
Often, spouses might be estranged for several years, and then one is going to buy a home for their new family or whatever, but they're still legally married.
Right.
Is there anything that happens there differently?
On the purchase side, not so much. It depends on it might have an impact on financing, potentially. If you're still married, it depends on how, and you don't have a separation agreement, then the financing might be a bit of a challenge. But if you're purchasing, it's not a huge issue if, let's say, you have a spouse that's not really in the picture anymore. It's when you go to sell, that's usually when we run into issues. So if that person then goes to sell, they would tick off that although they are married, the home that they are in is not a family home pursuant to the act. So, yeah.
Okay, so it's just a matter of signing a paper.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And generally, the other types of documents that we sign on the sale side, you're going to sign the deed, which transfers the property to the purchasers. Generally, we'll do what's called a bill of sale as well for the vendors to sign, and that includes whatever might have been in the agreement of purchase and sale with respect to other items in the property. Sometimes people will include appliances, a shed, lawnmower, any other implements. Some people might want to include certain items as well, furniture or whatever. So as long as we're clear on what those items are, we will then do on the sale side a bill of sale that indicates, your appliances, couch in the living room, however specific you want to get. The vendor will sign that bill of sale for those items, and then that transfers the ownership to the purchasers. Another item that the vendors will sign is what's called a statutory declaration. That covers off that they are Canadian citizens or citizens as defined in the Income Tax Act. We have standard clauses on PEI that the vendors are selling the property and that they have no knowledge that urea formaldehyde was used as a insulation. UFI they call it. Most people either have no idea or they can confirm.
Yeah, I've noticed that on the contract.
Yeah.
UFI / asbestos. So
yeah.
I wasn't sure what the UFI was.
Yeah, so I guess it was a type of insulation used back in the 70s and 80s. And it's essentially just a declaration that to your knowledge, it's either there or not there, or you don't know if it's there. So not a huge, I think one or two lawyers in their 30 or 40 years of practice have run into an issue with that. So it's not usually something that we have any problems with. The other kind of standard language too in the statutory declaration is that the vendor is going to leave the waste watch cards, which is always nice. So if you leave those. And then, yeah, I think that's usually about it. Generally, we work with the vendors we contact, if let's say you do have a mortgage over the property that you're selling, we, as the lawyer, will usually arrange to contact the bank and we'll request what's called a payout statement. And the bank will send us, let's say you're closing on February 15th, the bank will say, okay, on February 15th, the vendor owes $100,000 to pay off their mortgage. So we write a check. Once we receive the funds in from the purchaser, we write a check to the bank for $100,000, and that confirms that the mortgage is paid out. Then we pay out our legal fees, any other disbursements that have to be made. And then we usually provide the check then to the vendors. And people generally now are pretty savvy with their banking, and we usually do a direct deposit. So if the person leaves us with a void check, then we can do a direct deposit to a local branch here, and then it's done.
Okay.
So yeah.
I've kind of run out of leader questions,
sure.
But kind of, before we started, we were talking about like the trends in real estate.
Yeah.
The market's been really hot the last, year for sure,
No
2
question.
years.
Yeah.
What do you see driving those trends?
A few things. I think COVID has actually played a role, given that we have low numbers. A lot of people can work from home now. I've seen it in my own practice where I've had clients moving from Quebec, Ontario, British Columbia to PEI, given that we still comparable to those markets are way less expensive. That coupled with quite low mortgage rates I see rates as low as 1.25, 1.69%. That also drives refinancing that people are doing a lot of refis. So yeah, the problem that on PEI, quite frankly, is there's not enough inventory.
Yeah.
There's not enough houses for sale. So yeah, it's busy. I don't see it slowing down, but it's hard to predict. But yeah,
I noticed that duplexes are kind of the only things being built right now.
yeah,
And it's gonna kind of be like, 40 years when we're looking back at the architecture, that'll tell a story that,
yeah, no question.
that was
Yeah.
the way to keep up with inventory. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think too,
Yeah.
people are obviously, again, with the lower interest rates, people are, I'm just stretching themselves, but they're probably available to have more capital now than they ever have. And we're certainly seeing people buying duplexes, renting one side or the other. And farmland, if you can find it, is it's up now $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 an acre. But it's at such a low, like there's not much of it that if it's going on, it doesn't last.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, on the note of duplexes,
Sure.
is there any special considerations there? Like if somebody's buying one side of duplex and, the other side is being sold separately?
So yeah, what you want to make sure on a duplex kind of situation, you want to ensure that you have a discussion with your lawyer, but most duplexes have what's called a party wall agreement. So there's an agreement between the two sides that if there's any damage, who's responsible, and there's kind of a registered document at the registry that clearly indicates, where your property begins and where the other ends, type of thing.
Okay.
So that kind of party wall agreement is there. And one thing too, for purchasers on any type of, purchase, our role as a lawyer is we do what's called a title search. So what we do is we contact the title search office, and on your behalf, we request a title history on the property. And let's say for a duplex, for example, let's say if it's 5 or 10 years old, whenever it was built, it should have that party wall agreement in place. And then that would be part of the search that would come back, and that would outline, where the boundaries of the property are. If there's any surveys that are registered, we usually get a copy of those. And the big thing too is we want to make sure that if there's any mortgages, liens, or judgments registered against the property, we want to know about them when you're purchasing, such that then we can go to the vendor's lawyer and say, okay, we've got this mortgage has to be paid. There's a judgment against someone with the same or similar name that has to be dealt with, or there's a lien put on by a contracting company or something. That's kind of our role for protection as the purchasers, to make sure that when you buy it, it's free and clear of all the encumbrances and mortgages and things like that. So, yeah.
All right. So we're a little bit, still got a few minutes.
Sure.
We'll end early.
Yeah, no worries. No questions or anything?
Nobody's from the
From the
audience asking, so.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
Oh,
for taking
anytime.
the time to do this.
Yeah.
It was very informative.
Very good.
Right. Thanks to all who watched, and have a great day.
Thank you.